All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are joining live and to those who are going to be watching this. I appreciate you taking the time. This is our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. We are officially in week 3 and getting close to the end of it. Quite excited that almost all of you are making great progress. And if you feel like you aren't making as much progress as you like, just know that I'm pretty flexible and willing to work with you on assignments and assessments. So this workshop's held every Thursday from 8 to 8:30. And obviously you can come to the PowerPoint presentation and watch the recording if you aren't able to attend in person. Now, this workshop is a new one that's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. In week 1, we introduced, I gave an overview and introduced you to 2 big concepts in this workshop, which is conflict and cooperation. And then in week 2, we explored how we can define regional conflict and cooperation by looking at it in a hemispheric and a both inter and intra-hemispheric way. Now, what I'd like to do for week 3 is to help us operationalize both of these concepts of conflict and cooperation. And what we'll do is we'll start with cooperation this week, and then next week we'll operationalize conflict. Now, you might be asking, what are our learning objectives for this workshop? Well, by the end of this workshop, you should be able to do the following. First is identify at least one database related to international agreements. Secondly, identify at least one international agreement of interest to you. And I forgot to add this here, but to define operationalization. I'll go ahead and add it as I'm talking. Great. So we have these 2 big concepts of cooperation and conflict in this workshop. And obviously cooperation is where individuals, countries, regions of the world work together on some shared goal or task. And obviously conflict is the opposite of that, where there's tension or there's disagreement or there's an inability to cooperate. Now, what I'd like us to do is to bring this concept of cooperation into the real world further than we've done in the past 2 weeks to get a real sense of how we can think about it. Now, when we're operationalizing this concept of cooperation, first, it's important to recognize that cooperation in and of itself is a concept, right? It's something that it's an idea in our mind that we work with. But in order to bring this concept into the real world, like, flesh and blood, real life, we need to operationalize it. So operationalization is the process of converting a theoretical concept into an empirical referent. And you might be asking, what's an empirical referent? Well, that is a person, place, or thing that exists in the real world. So in other words, when we're dealing with concepts, we're dealing with ideas in our mind, or maybe in the minds of others. When we're thinking of operationalization of a concept, it's something that is a manifestation of that idea in the real world. Obviously, we can get into the nuances of all this, but that's the broad understanding for our purposes. So before I go into operationalizing cooperation, what I'd like to do is give some non-political science examples, since I think this is useful for folks to be like, okay, this is a new idea. I hear concept, I hear operationalizing, and I hear operationalization. And those might be new words to you. So first example is the concept of love, right? And some operationalizations of the concept of love could be a box of chocolates, right? An anniversary gift, a wedding ring, right? So the idea of love is in our mind, right? But then we have to bring it into the real world, and in the real world, it manifests itself typically in physical or tangible things. In this case, chocolates, some kind of present, or some kind of ring. Now, there's another concept of energy, right? And we can operationalize this into the following, like solar power, wind power, fossil fuel, human power, right? And each of those are different versions of the same concept, right? So this is the key idea here that I'm trying to stress, is that when we're thinking of cooperation, there's different versions of it in the real world that we can work with, that we can engage with, that we can study, understand, research, etc. So just like the concept of love, right, or just like the concept of energy, these will come into the real world in some unique way, and there are going to be different empirical reference for it. So when someone says, oh, let's talk about energy, in your mind, you might think energy like solar power. If you talk to someone else, they hear energy, they might be thinking gasoline. If someone says energy, they might be thinking how strong of a throwdown you can do in a Brazilian jiu-jitsu match, right? And so there's different ways of thinking about that, and the different ways that people bring it into their lives. So let's operationalize the concept of cooperation, right? So again, we have this concept of cooperation, and some operationalizations of it include international agreements, international institutions, international governmental organizations, and international non-governmental organizations. And what I'd like us to do is to focus on one of these operationalizations for this workshop, which is international agreements. In future weeks, we'll investigate these other ones as well. So what is an international agreement? Well, international agreements are formal understandings or commitments between two or more countries. An agreement between two countries is called bilateral, while an agreement between several countries is multilateral. And countries are bound by an international agreement are generally referred to as state parties. What's useful and important to note here is that international agreements are also known by other names. So one of those other names is called international conventions. So an example of a bilateral agreement might be how the United States and Mexico work together on the Tijuana River and on the Colorado River with respect to water flows, pollution, environmental concerns, usage, et cetera. Right, so there's a bilateral agreement between the United States and Mexico. A multilateral agreement might be CAFTA, which is a Central America Free Trade Agreement, which is an effort to bring free trade, basically reduce tariffs or taxes on the movement of goods and people in the Central American region with the United States. So I want to expand on this definition, but now we're going to think about it using the language of international convention. And I want to do this purposefully because I want to reemphasize that international agreements are also known as other things, in this case, convention. So international conventions are treaties or agreements between countries, right? International convention is often used interchangeably with terms like international treaty, international agreement, compact, contract between states. Conventions may be of a general or specific nature and between two or multiple states. And we obviously know the definition of bilateral, which is between two countries, or multilateral, which is between many countries. And in this example here, they give a plurilateral, which is between smaller states, but more than two, while they call multilateral between large states. That's actually a newer term to me, but I would just prefer using bilateral or multilateral. So when we're thinking of international agreements, we kind of have to start somewhere. And one way I like to approach it is like, what are the databases out there? You know, beyond going like Google it, where should I go to try to find a list of international agreements? So then from the list, I can then study them further. So here's a few resources that I like to share. The first one is the United States Department of State and their treaties and international agreements. I'll go ahead and open that link. And what I like to do is I'll have the computer read these first two parts. And let me see if what language I have selected here. So I have it in Spanish version. Let's go with this language. Okay.
Treaties and other international agreements are written agreements between sovereign states or between states and international organizations governed by international law. The United States enters into more than 200 treaties and other international agreements each year. The subjects of treaties span the whole spectrum of international relations: peace, trade, defense, territorial boundaries, human rights, law enforcement, environmental matters, and many others. As times change, so do treaties. In 1796, the United States entered into the treaty with Tripoli to protect American citizens from kidnapping and ransom by pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. In 2001, the United States agreed to a treaty on cybercrime. Read more about what specific bureau.
And so what's nice here is that the U.S. State Department keeps tracks of all the treaties that the United States is a party to or engaged with. And they have an Office of Treaty Affairs that helps to explore and to engage with this. So for example, we have resources page, and let's go and take a look at treaties in force. Obviously, always looking for our feedback. And in this case, they have a PDF document that lists all of those treaties in force. So we'll go ahead and take a look. And so here is our bilateral treaties in force as of January 1st, 2001 with the country of Mexico. So things related to property, to taxation, to transportation, to boundaries and boundary waters. So one of the examples on the Rio Grande. Another example here, the treaty relating to the utilization of waters in Colorado and Tijuana River. So I'll just zoom into that. This was the example I was alluding to earlier. So this is one database that we can go to. Second database is the United Nations Treaty Collection. And we'll go ahead and give this a moment to open. And I'll go ahead and post the link in the chat. And let's see if I can. Let's see here. Let's click on the overview. Well, in any case, this website essentially serves as a depository and a registration and the publication of treaties that are in effect between different countries around the world. So the first database was of US specific treaties with specific countries, while this one is looking at basically any treaties that exist between any countries around the world. So let's go ahead and take a look at the status of treaties deposited with the Secretary General. And let's look on examples of human rights. So we'll see what comes up here in a moment. And here's a range of them. So Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Paris, December 9th, 1948. Let's go ahead and click on that one. And here, this information gives us what the name of it is, when it went into force, or when it was initiated, and then when it went into force, when it was registered with the United Nations, its status. In this case, there's 41 signatories and 152 parties, which means there's 152 countries that are a part of this Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Here's the text of it. And then here it shows us who the participants are and when they either ascended to the treaty, succeeded from the treaty, or ratified the treaty. And that's a whole list of all the countries. And then it gives an example where here it says, unless otherwise indicated, the declaration of reservations were made upon ratification, ascension, or succession for objections thereto and territory applications here thereafter. So for example, the country of Albania says, as in regards to Article 12 of this treaty, the People's Republic declares that it is not in agreement with this article of the convention and considers that all the provisions of the convention should extend to non-self-governing territories, including trust territories. So what's interesting here is that even though there's a treaty that says we all agree to it, countries will say, here's parts of it that we don't agree to, right? And for someone who's studying international agreements and studying cooperation in general, this is perplexing because you would expect that if you're into an agreement that you agree with all of it. But because we live in because of the international regime that exists, which is we live in an archaic world and there isn't a single country or power that can tell other countries what to do, that means countries as sovereign entities can say, this is what we agree to, this is what we don't agree to when it comes to international agreements and other types of treaties. So that's a second example. And the last one I'd like to show, because this will lead us to the specific one I'd like to look at, is an International Environmental Agreements database. And I'll go ahead and have this part right here.
IEA Database Home. The IEA website is constantly being revised and updated. A major revision occurred over the course of 2017, with the addition of numerous bilateral agreements and a whole-scale updating of membership actions for all MEAs and a large number of BEAs. Current content includes over 1,300 MEAs, over 2,200 BEAs, 250 other environmental agreements, and over 90,000 individual country membership actions, dates of signature, ratification, or entry into force. Release notes here. A major thanks to Georg Balsiger and Loris German of the University of Geneva, who identified over 650 BEAs and have provided the foundation for the IEADB to become a comprehensive list of both bilateral and multilateral environmental agreements. A list of BEAs by decade is available here.
And so this database has been around for almost 20 years, and it basically focuses on environmental elements. And so we can search this for agreements that we're interested in. So we'll go and click on the Agreements tab. And let's go ahead and type a word that we would be interested in. So we'll type in whale. And we see here that there's two environmental agreements related to whales. The first one is regulations for the maritime hunting operations of whales in the waters of the South Pacific. And then the other one's the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, regarding right whales off the northeastern and southeastern coast of the United States. And so if we want to learn more, we can click on a link, and then it shows us the treaty name and text, who signatures, entry into force, who's terminated it, treaty type. In this case, it's a multilateral one. Lineage, like where does it come from? In this case, the Permanent Commission on the South Pacific kind of derived it. And who's responsible for maintaining it or overseeing it or fulfilling it is the Permanent Commission on the South Pacific, which should be a website, and then different information. So the point here is that you see that international agreement databases are healthy and robust, and you can engage with them to learn more about any particular topic that countries have entered into, either a bilateral agreement with another one or with multilateral agreements with many other countries. Now, what I'd like to do is to zoom in on a particular agreement, and it's the International Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. And we're going to open that webpage in a second. A lot of my students have asked, or I would imagine students would ask, why this treaty? Well, for those of you who are parents, you'll know the following quote: tuna fish, swimming through the water. And if you don't, then let me know and I'll get you a link to a short YouTube video about this song. Secondly, it's the chicken of the sea. So if you eat tuna here in the United States, most likely you're not eating it fresh, you're eating it from a can. I wish I had the can in front of me, but it's the green label and they always label themselves chicken of the sea. I remember growing up, I I asked my mom, like, why do chickens live in the sea? Or why do pollos live in the mar? And she's like, just laughed at me. She's like, no, it's fish. It's a tuna. And I was just confused for a little bit. Lastly, I wrote a paper about this in my graduate level course on international institutions, so I have some familiarity with it. First thing I'd like to do is take us to the International Environmental Agreements Database Project and to that specific page for this treaty. And note that this is to study the population of tuna and tuna-like fishes to make recommendations designed to maintain these populations at levels permitting maximum sustainable catch. And this is the official name. This is how it's known. It's just the ICCAT and the treaty text. So what I like to do is pull up the treaty text, because a lot of folks, I don't know if you ever had a chance to read an international agreement, but we're just going to take a quick look at it. And I'll go ahead and have the computer play or read us the preamble so that you know at least one time that you've heard and listened to an international environmental agreements preamble. So let's go and listen.
Preamble. The governments whose duly authorized representatives have subscribed hereto, considering their mutual interest in the populations of tuna and tuna-like fishes found in the Atlantic Ocean, and desiring to cooperate in maintaining the populations of these fishes at levels which will permit the maximum sustainable catch for food and other purposes, resolve to conclude a convention for the conservation of the resources of tuna and tuna-like fishes of the Atlantic Ocean, and to that end agree as follows.
So that's the preamble. And then from the preamble, there's different articles, and each article makes a statement or declaration. And in some articles, there's more than one declaration or statement. And essentially any country or state that is a signatory to this agrees with most or all of this. They might have some provisions where they don't. And obviously they'll specify that in the time of ratification or when communicating to the Secretariat for this treaty. So we have some data here. And what I'd like to do next is take us to the Secretariat's website. So if we click on this link, it'll take us to here, and then we can click on their actual website link. And we'll let this load. So there's a website, right, on the International Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. And let's go ahead and click on About Them. And particularly the commission structure. And then in this case, they have an organizational chart. So this commission has a chair from, in this case, Panama, and 2 vice chairs, one from the European Union, the other one from Morocco. And they have standing committees. In this case, a standing committee on finance and administration, a standing committee on research and statistics, a standing working group on the dialogue between fishery scientists and managers, permanent working group on the improvement of ICAT statistics and conservation measures. And so they have an entire governance structure in order to address these creatures. And one other thing I'd like to point us to is this, hopefully it's the organizational chart. So this is how this Secretariat, which is the body responsible for implementing or executing or overseeing the treaty, is organized. So there's an executive secretary, there's IT, there's an assistant executive secretary, and under them, there's a Department of Research and Statistics, Compliance, Translation and Publications, Administration and Finance. So for example, one of those of you attending live, Josue, you're studying Spanish, right? And one thing that you could specialize in is translating documents into Spanish for an international organization like the Tuna Coalition or the Tuna, the ICCAT, right? So there's a range of skills out there that can be employed and utilized in international relations and in this case, international agreements. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and move us to discussion. So I'll go ahead and stop recording. And there's 3 questions that I like us to think about. Is like, what international agreements would you be interested in? Why would you be interested in that international agreement? Who are the member states to that agreement? And which states aren't members to an agreement? And why would that be the case? So with that, I want to thank those of you who are joining live and for those of you who are watching the recording, and we'll go and get to our discussion. So take care.